No one noticed the old woman sitting on the cold metal bench outside the small grocery store in Ohio. People walked past her every day, young couples laughing, teenagers staring at their phones, busy men rushing to work. To them, she was invisible. Just another forgotten grandmother wrapped in a faded gray coat, her hands trembling as she held a small paper bag containing a half loaf of bread. Her name was Margaret Lewis. She was 72 years old. Margaret's eyes, pale and weary, scanned the crowd, but not in hope. She was not looking for friends or neighbors. She was looking for acknowledgement, a single glance to prove she existed in a world that had long since forgotten her. But no one noticed. For decades, Margaret had lived a life of sacrifice and quiet dignity. She had loved and lost, worked tirelessly, and devoted herself entirely to her family. Her husband Robert had passed suddenly from a heart attack, leaving her alone with her son Daniel, the only family she had left. She sold her wedding ring to pay for Daniel's college tuition, skipped meals so he could eat, and wore the same worn-out shoes for years to ensure he had new ones. Now, she sat in a rented room above a dilapidated laundromat. The ceiling leaked during heavy rain. The heater broke every winter, and the thin mattress she slept on made her bones ache. Every night, she whispered the same question to herself. Where did I go wrong? 3 years earlier, Margaret had still lived in the house she and her late husband had bought together. It was a modest home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by acres of unused land. The property had been Robert's pride, a small fortune in waiting, and Margaret had devoted herself to preserving it. She had supported him tirelessly, working odd jobs, caring for the garden, and managing every bill while he focused on his work. After Robert's death, the house became Margaret's fortress. She expected to live her remaining years in quiet comfort, her son Daniel nearby to share in the memories they had built. But life had other plans. One chilly autumn evening, Daniel came home late, his face tight with frustration. "Mom," he said coldly, "we need to talk." Margaret, sensing trouble, tried to mask her fear with a smile. "Did something happen at work, sweetheart?" Daniel rubbed his forehead. "My wife. She doesn't feel comfortable with you living here anymore." Margaret froze. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. "She says the house feels crowded. And honestly, you're getting old. You forget things. It's stressful." Her chest tightened. The warmth she had felt in her home for decades evaporated in that single sentence. "I'll try harder," she whispered. "I can stay in my room. I won't be a problem." Daniel avoided her eyes. "It's better if you move out." That night, Margaret packed her life into 2 small suitcases. 40 years of memories, reduced to clothes that barely fit her aging frame, and a few faded photographs. Her son didn't help carry the bags. Margaret's new reality was harsh. She tried to find work, but at 72, no one wanted her. She cleaned offices at night for cash, ate once a day if she was lucky, and spent long hours staring at the ceiling, wondering how life could have become so cruel. Her hands, once strong and capable, now shook when she held a cup of tea. Her body was frail, but her mind was sharp, and inside that mind, a secret burned brighter than any despair. Hidden beneath her thin mattress, wrapped in a worn cloth, was an envelope containing decades of documents, property deeds, bank accounts, and letters from Robert, written in secrecy. Papers that proved everything Daniel considered his own was never truly his. Margaret had never planned to use them. Not against her son, not against anyone, but the world had pushed her to the edge. And now, she realized, some truths could not remain hidden. During her first weeks alone, the world felt relentless. People passed her on the street, sometimes bumping into her, sometimes muttering insults or ignoring her entirely. The grocery clerk rarely offered a smile. The bus driver didn't slow down when she tried to board. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. And yet, Margaret survived. She found a tiny, dimly lit office to clean at night. Some evenings, the small act of sweeping floors, wiping tables, and emptying trash bins was enough to keep her grounded. On other nights, she wandered the empty streets, clutching her coat tightly against the cold, thinking of Daniel and the betrayal that had shattered her life. Margaret's nights were the hardest. In the darkness, her mind replayed her sacrifices, the sleepless nights raising Daniel, the meals she skipped, the long hours at jobs she hated, all so he could have more than she ever did. And now, he had tossed her aside like a stranger. One evening, as the streetlights flickered weakly above the sidewalk, Margaret noticed a young man leaving a coffee shop. He turned back, glanced at her, and without a word, handed her a warm cup of coffee. The gesture was small, almost meaningless, but to Margaret, it was monumental. For the first time in months, she felt acknowledged by a stranger. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced herself to swallow them. This was survival, not surrender. Margaret returned to her room, her fingers brushing against the envelope beneath her mattress. The weight of the secret felt heavier than the sack of laundry she carried every night. It wasn't just property or money. It was her life's work, her husband's trust, and the proof that Daniel had lived in a lie. Weeks passed, and Margaret plotted silently. Not revenge, not yet. But she began crafting a plan. Every day, she walked the streets, observed Daniel from afar, noted his habits, and imagined how the confrontation would unfold. Her heart, though weary, was unbroken. Her mind was sharp, and her resolve grew stronger with each passing day. She remembered Robert's words from decades ago. "The world may not notice the good you do, Margaret, but some truths are worth waiting for." And now she was ready. Margaret Lewis, the woman the world had ignored, the mother the son had betrayed, was preparing for a reckoning that would not only reveal the truth, but teach Daniel a lesson he would never forget. The cold Ohio wind swept through her room that night, rattling the window panes. Margaret held the envelope tightly against her chest, her eyes closed, imagining the day when the world would finally see her strength. It would be a long wait, yes, but she was patient, and patience had always been her greatest weapon. By the first light of dawn, Margaret was already moving. She cleaned her room meticulously, packed a small bag with essentials, and stepped outside. Every step she took felt purposeful, every breath measured. The city was waking up, unaware that a storm had quietly risen among its unnoticed corners. Margaret Lewis was no longer invisible, and soon Daniel and the world would learn that even the quietest voices could unleash the loudest truths. Margaret Lewis sat in her tiny room, the early morning light filtering through the cracked window. She held the envelope close to her chest. Its weight more than just paper. It was the culmination of decades of silent work, of sacrifices no one remembered, of love given without question. But to truly understand her strength, one had to go back decades, to the beginning of her life with Robert, and the young boy named Daniel who would one day betray her. Margaret met Robert in her early 20s, a kind man with dreams bigger than their small town could contain. They married in a simple ceremony, exchanging vows in front of a handful of family and friends. Margaret wore a modest dress her mother had sewn, and Robert whispered promises of building a life together, a life full of love, stability, and laughter. The early years were hard. Robert worked long hours as a carpenter, while Margaret cleaned houses and took odd jobs to make ends meet. Yet, even in poverty, there was warmth. They shared meals, laughter, and dreams. Margaret bore a son, Daniel, and devoted herself entirely to his upbringing. Sleepless nights, early mornings, and endless labor became her daily routine. Her life revolved around Daniel's needs, his education, his happiness. Every dollar Margaret earned went toward securing Daniel's future. She would often skip meals, wear tattered shoes, and endure exhaustion so that he could have what she never did. Neighbors would whisper about the selfless woman who gave everything without asking for anything in return. Margaret didn't care about recognition. She cared only about Daniel. As Daniel grew, he was clever, charming, and ambitious. But he also carried a streak of entitlement that Margaret ignored, blinded by love. She hoped that her guidance and sacrifices would mold him into a kind, responsible man. She never suspected that those very qualities, his ambition, his desire for comfort, would one day turn against her. When Daniel turned 16, tragedy struck. Robert, Margaret's partner in life and love, died suddenly from a heart attack. Margaret's world crumbled. She had lost her companion, her confidant, the man who had shared every burden with her. But she had no time to grieve. Daniel needed her more than ever. She buried her own sorrow, wiping tears in secret, and took on the dual role of mother and father. She worked even harder, managing the household, cleaning, cooking, and supporting Daniel through his teenage years. Margaret sacrificed every dream she had, every personal desire, to ensure Daniel's path remained smooth. She became invisible in her own life, her identity swallowed by the roles she played. Friends drifted away, hobbies were abandoned, and her own health deteriorated, yet she persisted. During these years, the house she and Robert had purchased, along with the surrounding property, became a symbol of her toil. Robert had once said, "This land will be worth something one day. Margaret, promise me you'll keep it safe." And Margaret promised. She safeguarded every deed, every account, and every secret from the outside world. The property represented not just financial security, but the legacy of her life's work. Years passed. Daniel excelled in school, attended college, and gradually began asserting himself in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. His charm, once endearing, now carried arrogance. He started questioning her decisions, expressing impatience with her routines, and subtly diminishing her role in the family. Margaret noticed but chose patience. She told herself, "He's young. He doesn't understand yet. Love requires tolerance, but tolerance has limits." By the time Daniel was in his late 20s, married to a woman named Amanda, cracks began to show. Daniel moved into the role of the provider, dismissing Margaret's presence in the household. He stopped consulting her on major decisions. Her advice, once respected, was now disregarded. Subtle slights became blatant dismissals, and Amanda, influenced by Daniel's growing arrogance, began to view Margaret not as family, but as a nuisance. One evening, Margaret overheard a conversation she would never forget. Daniel and Amanda were speaking in the kitchen, voices hushed but unmistakable. "She's too old, Daniel. She slows everything down. We can't have her here anymore," Amanda said. Daniel paused, tension evident. "I know I'll handle it. She'll have to move out soon." Margaret's heart cracked in silence. The boy she had raised, the man she had nurtured and sacrificed for, had decided she was no longer necessary in his life. Betrayal was no longer theoretical. It was real, palpable, and devastating. That night, Margaret packed. Every photograph, every letter, every memento of decades past went into 2 small suitcases. Her body ached, but her mind was sharp. As she left the house, she felt a strange mixture of sorrow and determination. sorrow for the life she had lost, and determination for the life she had yet to reclaim. In her new tiny room above the laundromat, Margaret discovered a new rhythm. She cleaned offices at night, walked the streets during the day, and scavenged for moments of human kindness. A stranger handing her a cup of coffee, a child smiling at her on the street. These were her reminders that even in isolation, life offered small acts of grace. And all the while, the envelope beneath her mattress whispered possibilities. Within it lay proof of Daniel's false ownership of the family property, decades of legal documents, and letters from Robert outlining the true guardianship of their assets. Margaret had never intended to use them, not out of malice, but out of love and hope that Daniel would come to appreciate what she had done. But life had shown her that love alone was not enough. Betrayal required action, and patience demanded strategy. Margaret spent her nights planning, not just for revenge, but for justice. Every day, she observed Daniel, noting his routines, his arrogance, his careless moments. She imagined the confrontation, the revelation, the look of shock that would cross his face when he understood the truth. The Ohio wind bit at her skin, yet Margaret felt a warmth inside, an unyielding flame that had survived decades of hardship. She knew the world had underestimated her. They had assumed that an old, frail woman could do nothing to change her circumstances. They were wrong. Margaret Lewis, the mother abandoned by her son and forgotten by the world, was ready to reveal truths long hidden, ready to reclaim her legacy, and ready to prove that even the quietest souls can unleash the most powerful storms. As dawn broke, Margaret stood by her window, eyes scanning the city streets. Somewhere out there, Daniel continued his life, unaware of the reckoning coming for him. Margaret's lips curled into a faint, determined smile. Today she was invisible. Tomorrow, the world would remember her. Margaret Lewis had lived decades in silence, giving her entire being to the family she loved. Yet here she was, alone in a cramped room above a laundromat, clutching the envelope that held the truth of a lifetime. It was more than paper. It was the culmination of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every bit of love she had poured into a child who would betray her. For months, she had observed Daniel from afar. She saw his arrogance, his disregard for others, and his careless enjoyment of wealth that had never been rightfully his. He moved through life blind to the foundation his mother had built, assuming everything belonged to him by right of inheritance, by the ease of opportunity. Margaret's nights were haunted by memories, each one sharper and more painful than the last. She recalled her husband Robert's voice, warm and wise. Some truths, Margaret, are too powerful to remain hidden. Wait for the right moment. That moment, she realized, had come. One evening, while sorting through the envelope again, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A small folded letter, almost hidden among the legal documents. It was from Robert, written decades ago. If anyone ever mistreats Margaret, the property and all assets shall revert immediately to her name. No heir or family member shall claim ownership until she is fully secure and respected. Margaret's hands shook, not from age, but from the sudden surge of power and clarity. The man she had trusted, the boy she had raised, had been living in a house that legally did not belong to him. It wasn't just about property. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about recognition, about the life that had been stolen from her by neglect and arrogance. Daniel's ignorance of these papers was his blind spot, and Margaret intended to make him pay attention in a way he would never forget. The next morning, Margaret walked through the streets of Ohio, her steps measured, her mind calculating. She watched Daniel from a distance, as he left his house, car keys jingling, his wife laughing beside him. He had no idea of the storm brewing quietly in the form of a frail, old woman he had dismissed for years. Her first step was strategy. Margaret began documenting Daniel's daily routines, noting his legal actions, his financial moves, and the people he interacted with. She wanted to ensure that, when she confronted him, the impact would be undeniable. There would be no question of doubt. Every word, every document, every detail would leave him with no escape from the truth. Days turned into weeks. Margaret balanced her cleaning jobs, her daily survival, and the meticulous preparation for confrontation. Every evening, she rehearsed her approach. She imagined Daniel's shock, the fear in his eyes when he realized that the life he assumed was his by right was nothing but a lie built on her relentless love and sacrifice. Yet Margaret remained calm. She had survived decades of hardship, poverty, grief, physical exhaustion, and emotional betrayal. She was no longer the woman who would quietly accept the world's injustices. She was the storm waiting to be unleashed. And then, one chilly afternoon, an opportunity presented itself. Daniel had left a stack of documents unattended on his desk at the house he believed he owned. Among them, Margaret recognized legal forms and financial papers she had carefully prepared decades ago. She saw the chance to begin her subtle reclaiming, to plant evidence that would force Daniel to confront the reality he had ignored. Margaret approached with caution, blending into the shadows like she had done for years. Her hands were steady, her mind sharp. She retrieved the papers, cross-referenced them with the envelope in her possession, and confirmed what she already knew. Every step Daniel had taken in claiming ownership was based on a misunderstanding, a deliberate blindness to the truth he had inherited. That night, Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the quiet streets. She allowed herself a small smile, one born not of malice, but of justice waiting to be served. She was no longer the powerless woman Daniel had dismissed. She was the architect of her own destiny, and Daniel was about to learn the weight of underestimating someone whose patience and love had been limitless. Margaret's plan began to take shape, a gradual revelation designed to maximize the impact of the truth. She would confront Daniel publicly, yet without a shred of visible anger. Every legal document, every hidden letter from Robert, would speak louder than her words. Daniel's arrogance would crumble, replaced by the realization of how blind he had been to the very sacrifices that had built his life. As days passed, Margaret's anticipation grew. She practiced her tone, her posture, and her timing. She knew that when the moment came, the world would witness a reckoning decades in the making. She had survived the betrayal, the isolation, and the erasure of her identity. But survival was no longer enough. She demanded recognition, justice, and above all, the restoration of dignity that had been stolen from her by the son she had once adored. Finally, Margaret felt ready. She held the envelope close, imagining the confrontation. She pictured Daniel's eyes widening, his face paling, the sharp inhale as reality struck. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to feel the thrill of impending justice, tempered by the deep sorrow of betrayal. Margaret Lewis, the woman who had been invisible, abandoned, and underestimated, was no longer a passive observer. She was a force of nature, quiet yet unstoppable. The stage was set, the evidence was ready, and the moment of reckoning was inevitable. The Ohio streets whispered in the cold wind as Margaret stepped outside, her head high, her heart steady. Somewhere, Daniel continued his careless life, unaware of the storm about to descend. Margaret's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile Today she was preparing. Tomorrow, the world and Daniel would see the true power of a mother scorned, a woman betrayed, and a life that refused to be forgotten. Margaret Lewis had waited years for this moment, and now it was here. She stood on the steps of the house she once called home, the envelope tightly clutched in her hands. The wind whipped her gray hair across her face, but she barely noticed. Her mind was sharp, her resolve unshakable. She knew exactly what she was about to do, and she knew it would leave a mark Daniel would never forget. Inside, Daniel was laughing with Amanda, oblivious to the storm that had quietly taken shape outside his door. He had grown complacent, believing that the property, the house, and the life he enjoyed were his by right. He had spent years ignoring the woman who had raised him, the woman who had built everything he now took for granted. Margaret stepped inside without knocking. Daniel froze, the laughter dying in his throat. "Mom," he stammered, trying to sound casual. "What are you?" "Sit down, Daniel," Margaret said calmly, her voice steady, carrying a weight that immediately silenced the room. "We need to talk about your house." Daniel's eyes darted nervously toward Amanda, who looked confused. I don't understand," Daniel muttered. "I've done everything Margaret opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, letting each movement emphasize the seriousness of her words. "Do you remember these?" she asked, sliding the deeds, letters, and financial documents across the table. "Your father trusted me to keep them safe, and I did. Everything you think you own never truly belonged to you." Daniel's face drained of color. He tried to snatch a paper, but Margaret's hand was faster. "Stop," she said firmly. "Read it. Every word. Every letter from your father. Every legal document. Your arrogance has made you blind, Daniel, but now it will make you see." He sank into a chair, trembling. This can't be real." Margaret's eyes burned. "It is. And now, you must understand the consequences of ignoring the woman who gave you life, who sacrificed everything for you. You've spent years living in a lie, Daniel, and it ends today." Amanda tried to interject, but Margaret's gaze cut through her words. "No, you will listen. This is the truth, and it cannot be avoided." Daniel's hands shook as he sifted through the documents, each paper unraveling the carefully constructed life he believed he owned. His jaw tightened, his mind spinning. The house, the property, the accounts, it was all gone from his control. The legal clause Robert had written decades ago ensured everything reverted to Margaret. Margaret sat back, her expression unreadable, though inside, a storm of emotions raged. She remembered every sleepless night, every meal she had skipped, every hardship she endured for Daniel. And now, the boy she had nurtured was facing the weight of that history, a history he had ignored for his own comfort. I didn't know," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. I thought it was mine." Margaret's voice softened, but only slightly. "You thought it was yours, because you never cared to understand. You took everything for granted, and now you see what ignorance and arrogance can cost you." Tears streamed down Daniel's face. For the first time, he truly saw the mother he had abandoned, the sacrifices he had ignored, and the betrayal he had committed by dismissing her. Margaret stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the street she had walked countless times, the same street that had once ignored her. She felt a deep, cathartic release. Justice was not revenge. It was recognition, clarity, and the restoration of dignity that had been denied to her for too long. "You may regret this, Daniel," she said, turning to face him one last time. "But that regret will not undo the past. It will teach you humility, and perhaps, if you are lucky, it will teach you respect." Daniel sat in silence, overwhelmed by a mix of fear, sorrow, and guilt. Margaret handed him the envelope, not as a gift, but as a testament to the truth. Every document within was a mirror reflecting the life he had squandered, the life he had ignored, and the woman he had betrayed. Margaret stepped out of the house, her coat brushing her legs, the sun illuminating her determined face. She was no longer the invisible woman the world had dismissed. She was a force, quiet, patient, and undeniable. By the time Margaret walked down the street, Daniel had begun making frantic calls, consulting lawyers, and desperately attempting to salvage what he believed was his. But the truth was already clear. The power he assumed he held had always been hers, and hers alone. Margaret returned to her small room that evening, not to hide, but to reflect. She had won more than a legal battle. She had reclaimed her dignity, her legacy, and the recognition she deserved. Her heart was heavy with sorrow for the years lost, but it was also light with the triumph of justice. She looked at the envelope once more and smiled. Every tear, every sacrifice, every hardship had led to this moment. Daniel's arrogance, Amanda's ignorance, and society's neglect had all been part of the test. Margaret had passed, stronger than ever. The night air was cool, but Margaret felt warmth in her chest. She knew the battle was not over. Daniel would have to live with this truth for the rest of his life. And the world, finally, would remember Margaret Lewis, the woman who refused to be invisible. As she prepared for sleep, Margaret thought about the days ahead. The property, once a symbol of her husband's dreams, would now become a place of purpose, community, and strength. She would help those who had been forgotten, feed those who were hungry, and offer shelter to those who had nowhere to turn. Margaret Lewis had survived betrayal, isolation, and despair, and now she would thrive, not because of what she had taken, but because of what she had earned: respect, dignity, and the undeniable power of truth. Margaret Lewis walked down the quiet streets of Ohio, the envelope safely tucked under her arm. The confrontation with Daniel had passed, and yet the weight of decades of pain and sacrifice still lingered in her chest. She had faced betrayal, injustice, and neglect, but she had survived. And more importantly, she had triumphed. Daniel, once arrogant and dismissive, now scrambled desperately. Lawyers, banks, and family advisors confronted him with truths he could no longer ignore. Every move he had made to secure his ill-gotten position crumbled under the weight of the legal documents Margaret possessed. He had believed that ignoring the past would keep him in control. He had believed that convenience and entitlement could erase decades of sacrifice. Now, he was learning that the truth was unstoppable. Margaret returned to the old house, the house that had once been her sanctuary, her prison, and now her reclaimed kingdom. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching the surfaces she had once cleaned with care, breathing in the memories of her husband, her son, and the life they had shared. Every crack in the walls, every faded wallpaper, every floorboard bore witness to her resilience. She smiled faintly, knowing that the years of neglect would soon be replaced with purpose and life. The property, once overlooked, would now serve as a haven. Margaret began by repairing what she could, fixing leaks, repainting walls, clearing overgrown gardens. Every small victory reminded her that she was no longer invisible. She was strong, respected, and unafraid. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. People who had ignored her presence for years now watched with awe as she restored the house, turning it into a place of beauty, warmth, and community. Margaret opened her doors to young mothers, children, and the homeless. She offered shelter, food, and guidance, transforming the property into a hub of compassion and empowerment. Meanwhile, Daniel faced the full consequences of his actions. His arrogance had cost him more than property. It had cost him dignity, respect, and the relationship with a mother who had loved him unconditionally. He reached out to Margaret, calling and pleading, but she did not answer, not out of malice, but because her journey was no longer about him. It was about the life she had earned through decades of resilience and love. Margaret knew that true power was not in revenge, but in the ability to rise above betrayal and create something lasting and meaningful. Her actions spoke louder than anger or punishment. Daniel would remember her not because she humiliated him, but because she had proven the unstoppable strength of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. As months passed, the property flourished. Gardens bloomed, children laughed in the yards, and neighbors came together in a sense of community that had once seemed impossible. Margaret Lewis became a symbol, not of bitterness, but of resilience, justice, and the enduring power of love and patience. She often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and pink. Memories of the past, the sacrifices, the betrayal, the pain still lingered, but they no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her legacy. Every step she had taken, every challenge she had endured, had led her to this moment. Margaret Lewis had survived. She had fought quietly, patiently, and with unwavering determination. And in the end, she had not only reclaimed her rightful place in the world, but had transformed it into a space of hope, compassion, and strength. Daniel, now aware of the depth of his mistakes, lived with a heavy weight of regret. He had learned, in the hardest possible way, that ignoring those who sacrifice for you can never be undone. Respect and gratitude are earned, nurtured, and recognized, or the consequences will be unavoidable. Margaret's story spread beyond her small town. People spoke of the woman who had been invisible, who had faced betrayal, and yet emerged not just victorious, but empowered to make a difference in the lives of others. Her legacy was not measured by property, wealth, or social status, but by the countless lives she touched, the lessons she imparted, and the unshakable proof that strength and dignity cannot be erased. In the quiet of her restored home, Margaret placed the envelope safely in a drawer, a testament to the past and a safeguard for the future. She had proven that patience, wisdom, and unwavering determination are the true measures of power. And as she looked out at the community she had nurtured, the children who played freely, and the families who had found shelter and guidance, Margaret knew that her life, once overlooked and undervalued, had become a beacon. She had transformed pain into purpose, betrayal into wisdom, and invisibility into undeniable strength. Margaret Lewis, the grandmother who had been dismissed, ignored, and underestimated, was finally seen, not as a victim, but as a force of nature, silent, patient, and unstoppable. The streets of Ohio, once indifferent, now whispered her name with respect. The world had learned that even the quietest souls can unleash the most powerful storms. And Margaret Lewis had proven that true strength is measured not by what is taken, but by what is endured, survived, and ultimately transformed into something extraordinary.